Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast. Interview episode, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World, with William Dalrymple. Hello everyone. Joining us on the podcast is historian, author, and broadcaster William Dalrymple. An award-winning writer specializing in the history of India and its surrounding regions, he has published over a dozen books, his most recent and prominent being the Company Quartet, chronicling the dramatic decline of the Mughal Empire and the rise of the East India Company. Many listeners may also recognize him from his podcast Empire, where he collaborates with co-host Anita Anand to examine the history of imperial projects across the millennia. Today, William is joining the show to discuss his most recent book, The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World, a survey of antiquity to the medieval period, focusing on the legacy of India's contributions, from religion and art to mathematics and astronomy. So, William, would you care to tell us a bit more about your background and what led you to becoming so fascinated with the history of India?
I've lived in India now for 40 years. I went on my sort of gap year between school and university and frankly never left. I mean, I did get a university, but I kind of came back straight away after I'd finished Cambridge. As a kid, I was always fascinated by archaeology. I spent my summer holidays on various archaeological digs across Britain. And slightly to my surprise, I spent my 30s and 40s writing not about ancient history, but writing about colonialism and the Mughal and East India Company periods in Indian history, the 18th and 19th centuries. After 20 years' work, I completed a quartet of books on the East India Company, and that was a sort of good moment to get back, in a sense, to my first love, to ancient history and early India. And this book, The Golden Road, is a return to my first love. It's all the wonderful early sites in India that I have always loved visiting, like Ajanta, Ellora, Sanchi. The Kushan period remains in Pakistan, the Gandaran stuff in Afghanistan. It's been an absolute joy to get back this early period, although it's a much more difficult period, of course, to write about in that the evidence is much more fragmentary.
Throughout the podcast, my listeners have been exposed to the history of India by the way of the invasion of Alexander the Great, the Mauryan Empire, the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms, and ultimately the Kushans and emergence of Indo-Roman trade. However, these are only small parts of the larger story you're trying to tell. Can you elaborate more on what you're referring to when speaking of a golden road in terms of an idea or scope of work?
Sure. Well, if your listeners are familiar with the Kushans, then they're well ahead of 99% of people who are likely to read this book. So I commend your readers for their breadth of knowledge, or indeed the Bactrian Greeks. These are things that remain, sadly, less well known than they should be. But this book is really not so much about Indian history itself, so much as about how Indian ideas diffused out of India and the degree to which Indian ideas transformed the world around them. The first and most important of those ideas is linked closely to someone that you have talked about on your podcast, the Emperor Ashoka, the Emperor of the Mauryan Empire. And Ashoka is about 3 generations after the death of Alexander, and very much in the heartland of your podcast. There are Hellenistic Macedonian kingdoms in Egypt and Anatolia and Iran. Seleucus and Antiochus and Ptolemy and their successors are all in power. And Ashoka is keen to spread his new ideas of dharma, of duty and religion and philosophy out into that world, having made a conversion himself. And there is this very extraordinary story, so very unlike any other story that we have from the ancient world. Most of the inscriptions that we have from, say, the Achaemenid Persians or the Greeks or the Romans, obviously are works of propaganda, putting up their achievements and talking about how wonderful they were. What's extraordinary about Ashoka's edicts is that they revolve around a war crime, and a war crime that he acknowledges and atones for. At the height of his power, he attacks his greatest enemies, who are the Kalingas, who are the people of modern Orissa on the east coast of India. And there is a sort of apocalyptic war that devastates the Kalinga kingdom, but also leaves Ashoka clearly profoundly shaken by the bloodshed and distress that he's caused. And it's around this time there is disputes about whether it's just before or just after his conversion, But certainly it is the Kalinga War that propels him to take his Buddhism incredibly seriously and to send out what he calls Dharma ministers. And these guys, according to one inscription in Kandahar, travel as far as Cyrene, which I'm sure your listeners will know is modern Libya, as in Simon of Cyrene in the Gospels. This is obviously a long way from India. And it's part of missionary activity and diffusion, which follows the Silk Roads, often using Buddhist monasteries as centers of Indic and Buddhist influence. Because the monasteries, as well as obviously being cultural and spiritual centers, act surprisingly as banks, lending to merchants. They act as industrial centers. Many of them are situated on mineral deposits, such as copper. Mezainak in Afghanistan is on the largest copper deposit in Afghanistan, which is why it's about to be destroyed by Chinese mining. Other early Buddhist sites in Malaysia are on the biggest iron ore deposits in the region. And we have at this period a clear relationship between the merchant classes of India, who are leaving India on trading missions to make money for themselves and their families. And they're very much the traders and the merchants rather than the farmers or the warriors, who initially are Buddhism's greatest supporters and patrons. And we see in the 200 years after Ashoka, not only do these missionaries, these Dharma ministers, convert all of India, including great swathes of India that had clearly been untouched by Buddhism up to that point, the Deccan, for example, the middle south of India, and Sri Lanka. We have very detailed accounts from Mahendra, the son of Ashoka, and his sister coming to Anuradhapura, which was one of the great cities of the era, the capital of Sri Lanka, and converting the king and all his people. And Sri Lanka then becomes the center of missionary activity, and you have missionaries leaving Sri Lanka and heading into Burma and Thailand and Laos and Cambodia. Meanwhile, other missionaries are going up to what's now Afghanistan and Pakistan, through to Uzbekistan. Others are passing through Tibet into China and beyond into Mongolia and Siberia, and others along the trade routes through the great nodes of the great trading cities of Chang'an and Loyang. This is an extraordinary diffusion of influence and power and spiritual ideas and cultural ideas and religious ideas, and the passage of monastic rules and Buddhist tales. All this whole package of Indic knowledge and Indic civilization spreads across the entire width of Asia in the most dramatic fashion over a period of about 200 years, leaving effects that are still clearly visible today all over Asia. But it's not just Asia. For example, as recently as 2 years ago, the archaeologist Steve Sidebottom, digging up Berenike, the originally Ptolemaic but later Roman port on the Red Sea coast, has found a huge amount of evidence of Indian sailors arriving in large numbers to trade pepper, cotton, silks, perfumery, ivory. As recently as 2 years ago, dug up this magnificent Buddha's head that stylistically looks very much the sort of North Indian Gandaran style, but is carved in Proconnesian marble from the Marmara Sea, and is a sort of perfectly classical Buddha's head in the white marble that we associate with Hellenistic and Roman sculpture. So there's a whole world that archaeology is unraveling now, which is new to us.
For many, the conception of Eurasia in classical antiquity tends to emphasize the importance of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean on the one end, and that of Imperial China on the other, perhaps most famously represented by the notion of the Silk Road. Yet in your book, you demonstrate the immense influence that ancient India had in numerous fields that goes well beyond this framework. Why do you think that civilizations like Greece, Rome, and China are able to achieve a level of worldwide recognition, whereas those of South Asia may not?
Well, I argue in this book, not only has India been omitted from the picture, there's precious little evidence of any direct contact at all between China and Rome, or indeed earlier. There's certainly what you might call capillary trade, in that a merchant will carry a good or a group of goods, a few hundred miles and take it to his neighbor, who will then move it on to the next stage of the trade route. But you're not getting what you get, during the Mongol period, for example, when Marco Polo, one individual, can at speed move from the Mediterranean coast to Kublai Khan's pleasure palace at Shangtu, or Xanadu, as Coleridge calls it, in a matter of months, using a passport from the Great Khan. It's not at all like that. In fact, there's very little evidence that China or Rome had more than the most passing hearsay knowledge of the other's existence. They're aware that there is some power at the other end of a continent, which is highly sophisticated and rich. But we can't name a single traveler who definitely passed unequivocally from Rome to China or China to Rome. But that is absolutely not true between India and Rome. Roman work, the enormous power and trading prowess of India, that he calls it the drain of all the precious metals of the world. And again, in a slightly Trumpian way, we now know that there were 30% tariffs raised at the Red Sea ports of Berenike and Myassormus on imports. So if you were an Indian sailor who just made the monsoon crossing up the Red Sea and arrived at Berenike, you could expect to pay 30% on your ivory or your peppercorns or your cottons or your silks. And some economic historians, this was initially a theory of Raoul McLachlan but in Northern Ireland, but it's been embraced by some major classicists in Oxford and Cambridge, particularly the Oxford Archaeological Department, who've embraced this theory with enthusiasm and produced a map of Roman coin hoards that show how incredibly integrated India and Sri Lanka both were to the classical trading networks because of the sheer number of Roman coin hoards that are turning up on the coasts of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And they are coming up with figures like possibly 30 to 40% of the entire imperial budget was being raised from import taxes on the Red Sea coast. You can quibble those figures, but that it was an incredibly important trade. And then as Strabo, your listeners will be well acquainted with, living in Alexandria, takes the governor of Egypt on a tour of India, and at Myassormus, another of the great ports of the Red Sea, he reports 250 vessels waiting for the winds to change to sail to India. So while on one hand we have only hints of or vague knowledge between Rome and China, with Rome and India we have fleets of vessels passing annually. And because of the way the monsoon winds work, India has this great gift in the classical period, well, throughout history, but particularly at this early period, of the monsoon winds which change direction every 6 months. The Tibetan plateau freezes in winter and cold winds blow in. Then around this time of year, in April and May, it thaws and warm winds blow out again. And what we see is that from this period, Indian sailors have only really got to put up a sail. And from the west coast, they can sail over to East Africa or to the Red Sea or to the Persian Gulf. And from the east coast, they can sail through the Malacca Straits to the Mekong Delta and to China. Then 6 months later, they can come back using these turbocharged monsoon winds. And once, like a surfer, has got skilled in using the massive waves of Hawaii, for example, and can surf beautifully on them, once these classical sailors learn how to use these winds and develop boats that can cope with them and utilize them, you can move from the coast of Kerala in southern India or the mouth of the Indus in Sindh or from Gujarat to Berenike or Myassormus in Roman Egypt in as little as 2 months. And you can do a round trip in a year, including having time to go to Alexandria, see a show, sell your goods, visit the pyramids, come back to Myassormus, and then jump on the reverse winds. So this was something that by the 1st century, by the time that a book called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is written, these were not just routes that occasional hardy pioneers took. These were mass transits where fleets of trading vessels were connecting the two worlds. And this is something that I know scholars have been aware of for some time. But I think it's totally failed to percolate into popular consciousness. We still have this very dominant idea of the Silk Road with these camels swaying over the Pamirs and saddlebags full of silks and spices passing through the Gobi Desert and so on. It's a lovely, very sort of Nat Geo image. But my contention in this book is that that's been hugely overrated and is barely present at all in the classical. You get people moving areas of the route, and for example, you get the Sogdians very much moving from Samarkand to China, but you certainly don't get anyone like Marco Polo in a classical guise moving all the way from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea with ease or in any sense that we are aware of as a regular route. And in contrast, you get this massive traffic with India that's completely failed to percolate into popular knowledge. So I'm saying that we're looking in the wrong place. It's not China, it's India, and it's not the overland routes, it's the maritime routes.
When I wrapped up my series on the Indo-Greek kingdoms, we touched upon the growing economic activity between the Roman Empire and India, a subject of focus in your early chapters. What sort of evidence did you find in your research that was most revealing to you, and how might it influence the way we look at the connectivity of India with the rest of Eurasia?
Well, the correspondence and the economic interaction and the trade between the Kushans, who take over from the Bactrian Greeks in the valleys of Peshawar and Gandara, this area around the Hindu Kush, is only one part of a much larger trading pattern opened up by the Roman conquest of Egypt. And after that, you have these vast fleets sailing backwards and forwards every monsoon wind from the Red Sea to India, from India to the Red Sea. And it isn't just the Gandara, which is reached through the Indus, and the mouth of the Indus, Babarakam, is one of the major trading ports. But there's also a major series of ports right down the west coast of India. And these include the whole of Gujarat, and particularly the port of Barigaza. And biggest of all is in Muziris, which is now in Kerala. You have this enormous volume of trade between the west coast of India and the Red Sea, of which also we should say Ethiopia is a part. And there are wonderful pictures of Ethiopian princes turning up with goods from Aksum and Meroe in South Indian courts, as were the Sasanians. The Sasanians were big competitors of the Romans and even attempt at various points to blockade Roman entry to the Indian ports, particularly during the Byzantine period when Justinian and the Sasanians are facing off in what's now eastern Turkey. There are substantial attempts by the Sasanian navy to stop Greek merchants killing anywhere near the Indian coast. And there's substantial competition between the Greeks and the Persians who get there. There are accounts, for example, from Sri Lanka of Persians saying, we are the greatest kings in the world. And according to the Greek account of this, the kings of Sri Lanka compare their coins and see that the Byzantine solidi are with better gold and of more substantial weight. So decide to trade with the Byzantines, but that's not from a neutral source. That's definitely from a Byzantine Greek source. So you have all these different trading groups at work in this very, very rich commodity market, trading silks, cottons, ivory, pepper. And we have some figures thanks to a document called the Muziris Papyrus, which is just one random shipping invoice. And the Muziris Papyrus contains details of one container which went from Muziris in Kerala to Alexandria, and it's like a spreadsheet with 3 columns. It's got the goods, which are mainly ivory, pepper, silk, cotton, nard, which is used in perfumery, and malabathrum. They give the second column prices, and the third column are, if you like, the tariffs, what the Roman Empire charges as custom duties for importing these things to Rome. And these are very substantial, and the prices are very substantial. And in fact, this single container, if it made it into Egypt, would have on its own allowed the importer to import, virtually the largest estate in Roman Egypt, or indeed a fair-sized estate in Roman Tuscany. So if you did this dangerous voyage to Kerala and made it there and back with your goods intact, then got your goods over the desert from Berenike to the Nile, then shipped them to Alexandria successfully, all intact, you stood to become, the Elon Musk of Alexandria. These are very, very expensive luxury goods. And they were clearly prestige items in Rome. And Pliny is rather sort of put out by this. Pliny regards this as unnecessary luxuries that the rich liberal elite, if you like, in Rome are enjoying. And he's very disgusted by what he says are these degenerate Roman women who wear see-through textiles, by which he's referring to silk. He says you can see the woman's shape perfectly. It's as if they turn up nude to parties. And he's equally put out by this, what he regards as the sort of woke spice, which is pepper. Why are the young spending so much money on this pungency? What's to be gained by putting it on your food, he says. And he disregards it as some sort of newfangled custom that only some ridiculous, effete liberal in Rome who'd never been on a galley in his life. And this is sort of Pliny, the naval commander, very much taking a sort of conservative view of things. Yet we know that these were highly expensive, highly desired items. We have one story of, I think, Lolina Polaina, who's a mistress of Nero, who turns up at a party in Rome wearing specifically Indian gems, diamonds in her hair, garnets on her breasts, God knows, pearls, I think, on her feet and in her tummy button. She brings the receipts to parties to show her friends how much they'd cost. But beyond the kind of extravagance of imperial Rome, economic historians are now sort of coming to the conclusion that maybe between a third and a quarter of the Roman imperial budget came from this customs tax at the tariffs on the Red Sea coast, and this was one of the main sources of imperial income. So whether it's Hadrian's Wall or the Sahara forts or the Rhine frontier or the Appian Way. Big capital-intensive construction projects in ancient Rome seem to have relied very heavily on this large sums of money being taken off Indian sailors as they arrived at the coast in order to sell their very, very expensive goods. When the British arrived in the northwest frontier and began excavating stupas and Buddhist monasteries, they found this very classical form of art, Gandharan sculpture, which they thought Buddhism with a Greek twist. Many of the bodhisattvas were wearing what looked like togas or himatian from Greek inspiration. And the British came to the conclusion that these were the Buddhists who were Alexander's troops who'd survived and had converted at some point to Buddhism, and that this was basically the last stand of the Hellenistic Greeks in the Hindu Kush. Alexander's last legions converted to Buddhism in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Modern scholars are now quite skeptical of this idea. And what most art historians seem to agree today is that the very clear classical influence on Gandharan sculpture in Pakistan and Afghanistan is not from the ancient Greeks, but the Romans. And that this came with Roman trade items, which were carried on these great fleets from Berenike and Myos Hormuz, punted up the Indus, and reaching, places like Bagram, which was the Kushan capital, underneath what was until 2 years ago the American Air Force Base outside Kabul, a place that famously was abandoned by Biden. Underneath that airfield is a Kushan palace complex, which includes a lot of extraordinary luxury goods from Roman Egypt, including porphyry dishes from Mons Porphyrius, the only source of porphyry in the world, wonderful ewers and things from this material, but also amazing beakers of painted Alexandrian glass with pictures of gladiators, Russell Crowe lookalikes, and the Pharos Lighthouse turning up in Afghanistan. And this Roman influence, contemporary Roman artistic influence, rather than ancient Greek influence, as the British originally thought, led to this classicizing of early Buddhist art. And you see many of the Bodhisattvas, particularly the Bodhisattva Maitreya, wearing robes that look astonishingly like those worn, for example, by the Emperor Augustus in his statues in the Forum. And in my book, I actually compared the two. I have a picture of Augustus on the left and a picture of the Bodhisattva Maitreya from Peshawar on the right. And they're wearing the same kit. One is in white marble, one is in black schist, but the drapery is almost identical. So a very interesting link is at this period, through Hellenistic influence, but Roman rather than actual classical Greek direct transmission, that you get the Buddha moving in the first century from being an aniconic symbol. He's normally in early Buddhist art represented by a stupa or a flaming pillar or the wheel of law. But in the first century, you suddenly see this familiar figure of this guy in a robe. And the robe is very classical looking. The earliest representation is usually said to be the Bimaran reliquary, which is a gorgeous little gold circular box, now in the British Museum, but originally from the Khyber Pass. From that point, you get these extraordinary Gandhara Buddhas with these faces that are, look as if they from Roman emperors or Marcus Aurelius or something, but with these moustaches. That, in a sense, is the last great Hellenistic imprint on India. Centuries after Alexander the Great, between the 2nd and the 5th century AD, you still have these very, very Hellenistic currents of art from the West influencing the art.
When it comes to India's religious and philosophical exports, my listeners would be most familiar with the spread of Buddhism westward into Central Asia under the patronage of the Emperor Ashoka, and its later flowering in places like Gandara. Yet this does not include a much wider range that incorporated China and as far east as modern Indonesia. In your opinion, what enabled Buddhism to penetrate so deeply across East Asia when it struggled to retain its primacy in the land of its birth?
Very interesting question, and one I don't have a good answer for. Scholars have come up with answers of why Buddhism dies out in India. And the answer is with the competition with Hinduism and the idea that Hinduism, where you have a temple where you can go and talk to the god and give offerings, is a more immediate and tangible religion than Buddhism, which is sometimes quite abstract. The Buddha has gone. Buddha's enlightened. You can't pray to the Buddha because he's no longer around. You're just talking to a statue. And this is, a very important part of Buddhist theology. The same is true of the Jains. Once you leave the cycle of existence, there's no point praying to the statue because you can do your religious exercises, but no one's listening. And that's all very well, but it doesn't explain why Buddhism does better than Hinduism in Southeast Asia, because throughout the classical period, you've got both Buddhism and Hinduism flourishing in India and in Southeast Asia. And the trajectory is that by the 12th century, Buddhism has become a very minority faith in India and will die out by the 14th or 15th century, other than in Tibet and in the mountains. While the opposite is true in Southeast Asia, where great Hindu temples like Angkor Wat, and we should be clear here that Angkor Wat was originally a Vishnu temple, a Hindu temple, those give way to Buddhism by the end of the Middle Ages. And you're finding Angkor Wat become a Buddhist site, which is what it is today. So it's very difficult to come up with an explanation of why Hinduism fails in India, which also explains why it does so well in Southeast Asia. But that's certainly the way it pans out. And you find that while initially kings are patronizing Buddhists very generously, the Buddhist embrace of non-violence that is obviously a problem for warriors. If your great claim to fame is that you're a great warrior, you don't want to put your sword down and become pacifist, which is central to Buddhism. This undermines your whole reason to be. And so the Rajput kings of India become very enthusiastically, particularly Shaivite and Vaishnavite. Those are the two Hindu deities that get the most patronage. While Buddhism languishes. And by the 12th century, it's really only in the east, in Bengal, and in areas of Kashmir that it survives at all.
On the other side, where my audience isn't as well versed in, are you able to explain more about the rise of classical Hinduism as the dominant religion of India and how it too made its way across the continent?
Sure. So the rise of Hinduism in Southeast Asia is closely related to the fall of Rome. India and Sri Lanka had both been the recipients of an incredible wave of Roman trade from the 1st century. And this continues through the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, with annual trading fleets coming with gold and giving large amounts of gold to Indian merchants in return for cotton, silks, ivory, and pepper. Also things like nard and malabathrum, which are used in perfumery. Now, that stops dead in the 5th century with the fall of Rome. Rome is besieged, various warrior bands are passing through the empire, the Vandals, the Goths, stuff all your readers will know well, the whole collapse of Rome, which is the most extraordinary moment in world history. And among the casualties are the Red Sea ports, where the Indian fleet's been coming and going to. Berenike and Myasomos both shut up shop and ceased to exist. They never ever become ports again. Both of them remain effectively archaeological sites until archaeologists discover them. And what happens in India is you have an economic crisis. This country, which you think of it, I suppose, as a sort of classical Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, once they've dug their oil wells, barely have to get out of bed in the morning. They have so much money coming in from their oil wealth. The same is kind of true of ancient India, which is getting, hordes of Roman gold turning up each year in return for very easily manufactured pepper and ivory, which seems to have been in abundance with huge herds of elephants all over South India. So there's a major economic crisis, and the response is remarkable. There are already in Tamil Nadu and in Karnataka these extraordinary merchant guilds called the 500 is the largest one, which are armed and dangerous. Think, the Iron Bank in Game of Thrones. These guys have their own assassins, their own weapons, their own military escorts, their own forts. And they pivot eastwards. So while the big trade of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries has been westwards to Rome, from the 5th century onwards, you see this pivot towards what the Indians call Suvarnabhumi, the lands of gold, by which they mean Southeast Asia. They mean Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, particularly Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, and the islands of Indonesia. It's at this period that you begin to see first small temples at the mouths of rivers, probably originally used by expatriate Indians, which over time begin to attract more locals, and you find them moving inland. In Thailand, you find what are called the Dvaravati wheels of law, which are these symbols of the Buddha's law raised on a stone pillar, which are monuments which survive all over central Thailand. You see Shiva lingams, the kind of phallic symbol of Shiva, appearing in temples on the Mekong Delta. You see images of what are called mitred Vishnus, which is the god Vishnu with looking a bit like a bishop's mitre or a skull cap or a kind of Ottoman fez, I suppose, on his head. And these, over the period of the 5th and 6th century, grow to monumental sculptures, some of them, larger than life size, often very magnificently carved. And then you see a wave of temples. You see initially carved very much on the Tamil basis. For example, there's a temple south of Chennai, which still exists, called the Shore Temple at Mamallapuram. An almost exact copy of that is made 5 years later on the island of Java. You see at a place called Gedong Songo, and you see, in addition to temples and temple statuary, you see the importation of the South Indian script called Pallava Grantha or Pallava Brahmi. And this is a form of the Brahmi script, which is popular all over India, but which is designed for South Indian palm leaves. Now, North Indian scripts have a kind of straight line, from a washing line, if you like, from which you hang the letters. But you can't make those horizontal straight lines easily on palm leaf because you rip the palm. So in South India, in Kanchipuram probably, a curvilinear script is developed, which is little rounded circles. That becomes the basis not only for modern Tamil and Malayalam in the south of India, but also for every pre-Islamic script in Southeast Asia, Mon, Khmer, Pew, and so on. So you see in script, you see the language of Sanskrit being imported as a diplomatic language in all the courts. The kings start giving themselves Sanskritic names. So someone whose grandfather was called Kodunga, according to one inscription, has a grandson called Mulavarman. Others call themselves Suryavarman. Surya is the god, sun god. Varman means protected by, so the name means protected by the sun god. In these little estuary ports, you find more and more Indian traders turning up. With them, you get Brahmins and Buddhist monks who set up their religious establishments. And you find a wholesale transfer of culture to the extent that you get now, the great Indian temple names and city names being born anew, just like you get a New York in America and a Perth, which is originally a Scottish town, reborn in Australia during the time of the British Empire. So during this period of peak Indian influence in Southeast Asia, you get Ayodhya, the capital of Lord Ram, reborn in Thailand. A new Kurukshetra, the place where the Battle of Mahabharata took place, reborn in Laos. And most extraordinary of all, the central river of Southeast Asia, certainly according to some etymologies, and this is disputable like all things in the scholarly world, but there's good reason to think that the main river of Southeast Asia is renamed after the Ganges. Ganga, Ganges, is pronounced in Khmer Mekong. So the Mekong is the Ganges, and it's not something that is widely understood, I think. So you find that effectively Southeast Asia goes over with the merchant classes embracing Buddhism, and the ruling classes, the kings, embracing a form of Hindu kingship and embracing the Sanskrit language, becoming what some scholars call the part of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, which stretches all the way from Kandahar in Afghanistan, right through India, through Bengal, through Burma and Southeast Asia, as far as Bali. So you get this great swathe of territory from about 250 BC through to about 1200 AD, which in a whole variety of ways is taking on Indian learning, Indian ideas of kingship, Indian ideas of philosophy, but also dance, music, sculpture. There's a whole transference of culture. And yet what's important to realize is it's not imposed by the sword. It's an empire of ideas, not an empire of the sword. And when these ideas flourish and flower in Southeast Asia, they do so in a slightly different form to what they've been in India. So, for example, Hinduism in Southeast Asia, often you find that there's women Brahmins that you'd never get in India. They're drinking beer and eating pork, and there's no caste. It's not, as some earlier scholars, particularly Indian nationalist scholars, like to believe, Hindu colonies or an Indian conquest of Southeast Asia. This is an empire of the spirit, an empire of ideas, where Indian ideas are flourishing, but often transforming. And so by the time you get Angkor Wat built in the 12th century, when the great Indian writer Tagore goes there, he says, everywhere I could see India, but I could not recognize her. In other words, these seeds from Indian gardens have taken root and flowered in odd and surprising ways.
Now, you delve into many topics throughout the work, and while I won't continually punish you by having you recite all of them from start to finish, Can you speak to an idea or theme that you found to be especially intriguing regarding the impact of ancient India in ways that maybe aren't as widely known or appreciated by the general public?
Well, I think in the West, India is often associated with religion and mysticism and spirituality. So, in a sense, the part of my book, which is about Buddhism and Hinduism, may not be entirely surprising to anyone, although the scale of the spread of Buddhism and the degree to which it took Indian ideas right across Asia is perhaps something that people don't realize, nor the way that an Indian language, an Indian sacred language, Sanskrit, became the language of court diplomacy, of high educated courtly discussion, secular and religious, all the way from Kandahar in Afghanistan today to Bali, now in Indonesia, for a period of 600 years. But I think the thing which will surprise most people in the West, and very few people, oddly few people though, is the whole story of India's contribution to mathematics, and indeed the fact that it was the source of the numbers we use every day. That's obscured by the fact that in the West, certainly for 100 years, but not before, interestingly, we've referred to these numbers as Arabic numbers, which is perfectly logical because the West did indeed get them from the Arabs. But the Arabs got them from the Indians. If you trace the numbers in front of you on your laptop or on the mobile phone that you're holding or listening to, maybe, you will find that they originate, their seeds are really the Brahmi numbers of the late Mauryan Empire. And they have a sort of renaissance in mathematical genius, which you get during the Gupta period which is about sort of 300 to 400 AD in India. And this is a period of great cultural achievement in all fields in India at this time. You get Kalidasa, who's sometimes referred to as the Indian Shakespeare, great dramatist, but also great poet, author of Shakuntala, for example, and The Cloud Messenger. These are being produced in the great intellectual and cultural capital of Ujjain. At the same time, in Pataliputra, which is the other great capital of northern India, on the banks of the Ganges, close to modern Patna, or under modern Patna, lives Aryabhatta, who's not a name that will really mean much to many people in the West, though every Indian will have heard of him and very proudly know his achievements, which were, in 300 AD, to get the exact circumference of the Earth, to calculate the exact distance from the Earth to the Moon, to realize 1,000 years before Galileo that we live in a heliocentric universe, that the Earth revolves around the Sun, and many, many other extraordinary achievements. And his work is taken forward by his pupil and successor, Brahmagupta, who actually lives in Western Rajasthan about 50 years later in Mount Abu. And Brahmagupta is the man who really defines zero. Zero had been around as a sort of placeholder, as an absence, if you like, between positive and negative numbers since probably Persian or Babylonian times. But Brahmagupta, meditating on the very Hindu or Muslim concept of sunya, the void, realizes that zero is actually a number with qualities like any other. And he lists, I think, sort of 46 different qualities of zero, for example. That's the number you get if you divide a number by itself. He turns zero into a number with powers like any other number. And this allows you to do things like place value, decimal system, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. It allows you to, moreover, express any number with just 9 symbols and zero. This is a vast conceptual leap for mankind. The rest of the world, or particularly the European world, is lumbering around with Roman numbers, CCM, X, V1, try doing long multiplication with that. This incredible leap leads to an extraordinary development in Indian mathematics, but also the linked sciences of astronomy and astrology. All mathematics, astronomy, and astrology are all regarded as one science in ancient India, which is called Jyotisa. And this spreads through India and is universally known in Indian kingdoms by the 5th and 6th century. And then it makes this leap into the Arab world in, well, we know the exact year, 776, when the viziers of Baghdad called to the neighboring Indian state of Sind to send the 2 great works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, which seemed at some stage to have been sort of bound together. And the Arabs call the book that arrives the Great Sind Hind. And in due course, that's translated by Al-Khwarizmi, who writes a book called Book of Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculations. Obviously a bit of a mouthful, even in English, it's worse in Arabic. So people know it as just by the nickname Al-Jabr, which of course is our word, algebra. While Al-Khwarizmi's own name becomes algorithm. So these two sort of crucial concepts of mathematics and the doorway to higher mathematics, the algebra and the algorithm, are products, if you like, of this meeting of Indian mathematics with the Arab world. Intriguingly, the viziers of Baghdad who bring these books to Baghdad are themselves from an Indic background. They are formerly, before converting to Islam, they were the Buddhist abbots of Nawbahar in Balkh in Afghanistan. Their grandfather had studied higher mathematics in Kashmir, and they are Sanskrit literate. Indeed, they have risen to power as the viziers of Baghdad because they're effectively very efficient Indian accountants. They run the military accounts during the Abbasid Revolution when the Abbasids are overthrowing the Umayyad dynasty in the 700s. One of their number, Khalid ibn Barmak, is called to be vizier of Baghdad, and there are 4 generations of these Barmakids, as they're called, running the business of Baghdad. But Barmak is itself just an Arabicization of the Sanskrit word, Pramukh, which means boss. And so these guys are, I suppose, ethnic Persian, Afghan, but very much part of the Indic intellectual world as part of the Buddhist, running this Buddhist monastery in Afghanistan, which had a famous library. And these guys are the gateway for Indian numbers to reach the Arab world. And in Al-Khwarizmi's translation, which adds a bit of Euclid, a bit of Ptolemy, and is more than a translation because it brings together Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, unravels them, clarifies them, adds a little bit of Greek geometry. This spreads around the entire Arab world, spreading through Palestine, Egypt, Libya, westward to Morocco, Algeria, and eventually to Arab Spain, where on the borders around Spain, by the 950s, you're getting Christian monks in Barcelona studying what they call the modus Indorum, the Indian method of numbers. But despite the fact that one of the popes, Pope Sylvester, adopts this method and goes to Rome, it doesn't spread to Western Europe initially. And in fact, Pope Sylvester is chased out of Rome and accused of sorcery of the Saracens because of his embrace of these Eastern sciences. It's only with 1170 when Pisa founds a trading colony in Algeria, and the man that runs the colony brings his young children, and they go to school in Algeria, learn Arabic and Arabic numbers, and they get back. And one of those kids is Fibonacci. And Fibonacci writes the Liber Abaci, which introduces these Arab numbers, as we call them, the modus Indorum, as he calls it. And he is summoned to the court of Frederick II, and Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, adopts this system. And this leads to a whole wonderful system of Italian money lending, the Medici Bank. And then it goes further, because one of the people that reads Fibonacci and embraces it is the great painter Piero della Francesca. And Piero writes 3 mathematical treatises based on Fibonacci, one of which is then taken to Milan by his friend Fra Luca Pacioli. And Fra Luca shares it with his flatmate, who is in Milan painting a picture of the Last Supper. And that, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci. So you get from Leonardo da Vinci to Aryabhatta in just 5 leaps. Leonardo to Piero, Piero to Fibonacci, Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta, Brahmagupta to Aryabhatta. And that is how we get the maths and the numbers system we use today, which is the nearest thing the human race has to a universal language. I mean, it's a big deal. We should know this stuff. And just to sort of call it Arabic numbers and forget its origins in India, frankly, is not good enough. This is the kind of thing we really, really should know.
I think that this will be an excellent place to end our discussion, and I would like to thank you once again for taking the time to speak to my audience about a topic that is so near and dear to my heart. If any of my listeners are interested in getting their hands on a copy of The Golden Road, which has just released in the United States this past April, or perhaps looking to keep up with any of your upcoming projects, what might be the best way for them to do so?
Well, other than reading the book or turning up at the literary festival I organize every winter in January in Jaipur, which is the largest literary festival in the world, the Jaipur Literature Festival, twice a week they can log into my podcast. I'd hate to divert anybody from this brilliant Hellenistic Age podcast, which I enjoy so much, but you might think of occasionally fishing in other waters and logging on to Empire Pod UK, which is available at all the usual pod handles, Apple and everything else. And I co-host this with the wonderful Punjabi historian called Anita Anand, who is a wonderful and sparkling presence. and we discuss empires ranging from the Hellenistic age right up to what we're talking about at the moment is the Opium Wars with China. Last month it was British colonialism in Ireland. So there's all sorts of stuff we do. We got around. Next month it's going to be Yalta and the post-war collapse of empires. All sorts of stuff to listen to there. Then, of course, there's a whole 10 books I've written, which might be of interest to listeners here. One of them, From the Holy Mountain, deals with the sort of post-Hellenistic age, the early Christian period on the Holy Mountain. But most of my work over the last 20 years has been on the colonial period. And there are 4 books which have now been boxed up as the Company Quartet, The Anarchy, White Mughals, Return of a King, and The Last Mughal.
I will make sure to include all of these links in the episode notes and the podcast description. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and in the meanwhile, you've been listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast.